Today, I'd like to talk to you about recent studies we've done where we try to use dynamical analysis to isolate signatures of conscious access with or without report. So I guess you're very familiar with the term, but just to recapitulate what I mean by conscious access, I mean the fact to take cognitive grab to an information. Usually we think about perception. When we are awake, sometimes we can become conscious of these contents, and sometimes they seem to be processed unconsciously. And a nice example of that is motion-induced blindness. So if you don't know the demo, you just have to focus on a little green dot that is going to flicker at the center of this screen. So you look at this green dot and you just relax and see for yourself what's happening in your conscious access. So maybe you need to get close to the screen, but normally you should at some point see one or several of the yellow dots around disappear. And what's interesting is that they don't actually disappear from the screen. They disappear from your conscious access. So they impinge your retina, but although they are processed to some extent by your brain, you don't have access to that. And so one of the big questions in consciousness studies is to understand what's the difference in your brain when you're processing the same information consciously. You have conscious access to this information or not consciously. And obviously, it's an interesting question of its own, but it's also very relevant to try and understand what makes the difference between conscious perception and unconscious perception, to then interrogate consciousness in patients with disorders of consciousness or non-communicating patients. So I won't be too long on that because I think you all know what I'm talking about, but I'm talking about unresponsive wakefulness or minimally conscious states. So these patients that seem to be awake to some extent, but for whom clinical examination is sometimes not enough to determine whether they are conscious or not. If we understand in healthy subjects what's the difference in their brain when they become conscious of an external information versus not, we might interrogate the same signatures using EEG, for example, in these patients to try to infer whether they have conscious access to the external environment. So that's the general goal. And today I'll be presenting essentially studies that are focused on trying to isolate and understand the neural signatures of conscious access in healthy volunteers, and some preliminary data and that I'd like to discuss with you where we try to transfer that to patients. Okay, so first, what do we know about these neural correlates of conscious access? Well, we know much more than 50 years ago, because when we contrast conscious versus unconscious processing, we can see all the neural events that differ between these two processes. But what we observe is that actually in different protocols, we observe that any stage of stimulus processing seems to be in one protocol or another correlating with conscious access. We see that in some experiments, we see that the difference between conscious and unconscious processing in very early events, we can see this difference. In other protocols, we see these differences that occur late. And because these are only correlates, the current question now is to find within these different correlates, isolate what corresponds really to the stage where conscious processing is occurring. And I think we're really at this question at this moment of the research now. And we can roughly identify two different views, two different propositions. The first proposition is that the signature of conscious access, the mechanism that make you conscious of an information occur rather early and through the local recurrence of activations within the sensory areas that are responsible for the representation of the stimulus. Okay, and in this view, then all the correlates of conscious access that occur after that are just consequences of this initial becoming conscious of the stimulus. Okay, they are downstream events. Another possibility is the one defended, for example, by the global workspace theory, which postulates that what it takes for you to become conscious of an information is to have sensory information shared by higher level areas that allow some flexibility in the process, some maintenance and flexibility in the processing of this information. And in this other extreme, then what happens before that are just precursor of conscious access. For example, if sensory processing was a bit better initially, then it will more likely lead you to this, but this is really the signature of consciousness. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. I see no faces, so I don't know, but I assume that's clear. So how can we disentangle these two options? Well, the path we've been taking for a little while is to explore whether we can find dynamical signatures that can help us isolate these mechanisms that are specifically linked with consciousness. So can dynamics or dynamic analysis help us isolate these signatures? So why we think that? Well, maybe I'll go back a few years. An initial study we did in attentional blink, where we found very specific dynamics associated with conscious access. So I won't explain the details of the attentional blink. All you need to know is that in the attentional blink, you have a nice stimulation that comes on screen for long enough to become conscious, but it's in attentional competition with another stimulus, so that for repeated trials of the same stimulation, you will sometimes say, "Oh, I've seen the stimulus," and sometimes, "Oh no, I haven't seen the stimulus," for exactly the same external stimulation. So obviously that's very interesting for a neuroscientist, because then we can stick EEG electrodes on your head and sort the trials according to whether you tell us that you've seen the stimulus or not, and see what are the brain activations that go on in between, okay? And what we observed in this experiment with this particular attentional blink protocol is that the initial sensory processing of the stimulus, that was a visual stimulus, was exactly the same, whether at the end people said, "I haven't seen anything," or "Yeah, I've seen it quite well." And we saw this up to 250 milliseconds after the presentation of the stimulus. But then we saw a rapid shift in the pattern, and we saw a series of waveforms that were only triggered when at the end the subject said, I've seen the stimulus, and not in the other case. So that was suggestive of a transition to a special dynamic with all or none waveforms, all or none late waveforms associated with the fact of consciously perceiving the stimulus. And if we look at the source reconstruction, so that's EEG source reconstruction, so we must be careful. We can't build too strong conclusion on that, but still you see they make sense. Here you see the activations when people have seen the stimulus, here not seen, and this is seeing the brain from below. And this is a little timer relative to the presentation of the stimulus. We'll see that initially we have strong occipital activations in response to the visual stimulus. It's as strong when people have seen than when they have not seen. It progresses to the temporal cortices. That's really what we expect. And then suddenly around 250 milliseconds, we see this divergence where activations, if there remain activations, are really local in not seen conditions, and they, on the contrary, seem to grow and maybe start to invade parietal and frontal areas when people have seen the stimulus. And we see that in the late period, we have a succession of activations that take many areas of the brain when people said that they've seen the stimulus, frontal, and you see temporal reactivations when people say that they've seen the stimulus. But when they say they haven't seen the stimulus, it seems that these late activations do not occur. So that was a first indication that maybe conscious access was associated with a nonlinear dynamics, interesting dynamics. And then other studies also showed, in a different way, seemed to suggest that these discontinuous dynamics were occurring in relation to conscious access, and that was using masking at different strengths. So the stimuli that were masked were shown at different durations. So stimuli shown for 16 milliseconds were actually completely subliminal, and around 50 milliseconds, people were around threshold. And they observed something similar, which is that the initial waveforms, the sensory waveforms seem to scale with the strength of the stimulus, follow the strength of the stimulus, while later activity seemed to show some aspects of all or none dynamics, meaning that stimuli that were below the consciousness threshold did not evoke these late activity, whereas stimuli that were above this threshold did evoke this activity. Okay, so at this point, we thought that maybe these peculiar dynamics might be interesting for trying to isolate the mechanisms of the signatures of the conscious access, and maybe if they could be used for that, they could be very valuable to interrogate consciousness in non-communicating patients, because you can read discontinuous dynamics directly from the brain recordings, as we see here. Okay, but before we can really establish that, we need to see whether this dynamical signature is really general. And from the studies I've shown you here, we were only with visual stimuli, and another important aspect is that in both masking studies and the attentional blink studies, the stimuli are fast transients themselves. So it's not impossible that the stimuli themselves create some strange dynamics, because they do have discontinuous dynamics initially. Okay, so we need to generalize these effects to other situations. And another very important question we need to address is whether these late activities really reflect conscious access in itself, or whether they reflect task-related processes. They might be downstream events from the conscious access. And that's an interesting topic that was put forward notably by Tsuchiya and Lamme and other authors who noticed that most of the studies interested in the neural correlates of conscious access ask participants to report the stimulus. So maybe the neural correlates of conscious access that we see contain a confound, which is actually a consequence of conscious access, which is that when you become conscious of a stimulus, you're also able to do the task, report the stimulus, make some introspection. Maybe these late activations are simply introspection. So we needed to address all these things, and that's what directed the design of our next experiment. Sorry, I need to close my door. Yes. So working from home. And so so in this experiment, where we tried to see whether these this continuous dynamics could be useful to isolate the signature of conscious access, we decided to go for audition and not vision, use very simple stimuli around threshold, so no masking, no fast transients in the simulation, and also we decided to make the same experiment with the same participants with a task and without a task, so that we would have a stepping stone between the full-fledged conscious access experiment with a report from the participant to a healthy participant doing the same but with no report, and then maybe go to the patients. Okay, and more specifically, in this experiment, we chose to have people hear a continuous threshold equalizing noise. So basically, shh, like this. So you had that in your ears, and you would hear one or two. Well, you could hear two types of vowels, either A or E, the French ones, inserted in this noise. And there were 6 levels of intensity relative to the noise. So that's why it's negative. From minus 13 dB, that was the lowest sounds we had, which was really below threshold, to minus 5 dB, which is really audible, plus no sound trials. Okay, so people were listening to that, and they performed 2 types of sessions. In the active sessions, at the end of each trial, at the end of each presentation of the stimulus, they had to report the identity of the vowel and to rate how well they've heard the vowel. In the passive session, the moments where they were listening to the stimulus were exactly the same, but at the end of each trial, they, instead of having a task to do on the stimulus, they had to perform a quiz, or to make some mind-wandering judgment, something completely unrelated to the target, and they were informed that the vowels were irrelevant for them. Okay, right. So before I go to the results, I need to also describe an important aspect of this experiment, which is that instead of going on with rather descriptive ways of analyzing the dynamics, we decided to really model what we meant by gradual versus bifurcation dynamics. And okay, so these are the two types of dynamics that we might want to contrast. One possibility is that some neural events will follow unimodal dynamics, meaning that when you increase stimulation strength, you will see across trials an increase in activity. So for unimodal dynamics, you can imagine that activations will increase with increasing stimulation, and that activity across trials will just group around one mean. Okay, donc, so that the distribution of activations across trials will follow unimodal dynamics. So that's, I guess, very familiar with you. And we want to contrast that with another type of dynamics, bifurcation dynamics, in which when it comes to stimulation values around a certain threshold, what happens is that for the same stimulation, you have two possible groups of trials. On some trials, the event was not triggered and activity remains at baseline. And on some other trials, you reach another state and activations across trials group around another mean, a higher mean, here represented here. And you can imagine that this higher mean will then scale with the strength of the stimulus, okay? That in this case, you'll have a bimodal distribution of activations for these levels of stimulation, okay? And the idea is that these two levels might correspond to non-conscious versus conscious processing. Okay, so how do we disentangle these two types of dynamics? Well, if we do what we usually do with neural activations and average activity across trials, we might not be able to diagnose correctly the dynamics. And it's not entirely surprising, actually, when we do that, when we average across trials, we implicitly make the assumption that the mean is a good summary statistics because the underlying distribution is unimodal, okay? Another coarse summary statistics that we can look at then, if the mean is not useful, is variability across trials. And variability across trials might be diagnostic because for unimodal dynamics, we expect variability across trials to either stay flat or increase with the mean, scale with the mean. That's a usual process. While for bifurcation dynamics, we expect a very specific pattern where we see a burst of variability around threshold because you have two types of trials evoked by the same stimulation. And then as you go high or low away from threshold, variability should decrease as you go back to a regime where all the trials group together around one mean, okay? So we thought, okay, maybe that's just a coarse way to detect and diagnose whether we are in a unimodal dynamics or bifurcation dynamics. And that's something that we never do in experiments or very rarely do. So let's have a look at this simple experiment and see whether at some point we see this pattern emerge that is suggestive of bifurcation dynamics. First, we can look at the behavioral results, and just to let you see that indeed we were around the behavioral threshold with these stimuli. That's for identification performance. That's for mean audibility. So as audibility was rated on a continuous scale, we could also derive a meaningful measure of variability. And if we look at variability in audibility, we already see this burst of the variability of the ratings when we present a stimuli around threshold stimulation. And these are the actual distributions behind this pattern of variability. And we see that this burst of variability seems to be occasioned by a bimodal distribution. So it seems that sometimes people rate the same stimulus as not heard at all, and sometimes as quite heard quite well. Okay, so that's the first indication that even with these very simple auditory stimuli, we have, at least behaviorally, this kind of split in the behavior. Well, this kind of split between two types of tribes. Okay, let's now turn to the brain dynamics. Maybe I haven't mentioned that, but these results are on 20 participants using EEG. And here are the typical ERPs we obtain, so waveform we obtain for the strongest stimulus. We have exactly what we expect, so an auditory N1, and then a late positive event that we might call P300 here. And to start with, we might want to just look at the profile of mean and variability for a group of electrodes here that capture well both this N1 and this P300. So if we look at the mean of these mean activity across trials, we see that indeed it increases. So this negative activity increases, or this positive activity increases with the stimulation strength. But as we've seen in the simulations, this can help us determine whether these dynamics are correspond to unimodal dynamics or bifurcation dynamics. If we then turn to the pattern of variability across trials, initially we see a linear increase in variability with stimulation strength, which seems to correspond to gradual increase in activity across trials. But then from 300, 400 milliseconds, we see very clearly this pattern expected from bifurcation dynamics, where we have a burst of variability around threshold stimulation. So that's the first sign that we were expecting to see in the data, and that shows quite clearly, that seems to suggest that these initial processing there follow gradual dynamics, whereas these late ones seem to show bifurcation dynamics, probably underlined by two types of trials for the same stimulation when we are at threshold. Okay. So this is a simple analysis using ERPs over a group of electrodes, but we observe the same profiles when we then do multivariate pattern analysis and use the information of all the electrodes to summarize all the activity that relates to the processing of the stimulus, and we see the same. Okay, so now, so far, we've used summary statistics, and we've added the variability analysis to try to disentangle these two dynamics. Now we can go a bit more into details and look at the distribution of responses. So if you remember, in unimodal model, we predict that activations will increase around a single mean, possibly with a gradual increase in variability also, which is expected from Poisson dynamics, which is a very general phenomenon. While in the bifurcation models, we expect that when stimulation is around a certain threshold, we'll see bimodal distribution occur with the height of the distribution decreased, and then again unimodal distribution coming up when we go away from threshold stimulation. Okay, so this is these are the two patterns that are predicted. We can actually draw the distribution of responses across trials that we obtain in this late period of activity for our different subjects. And this is what we observe for one particular subject. So that's data from one subject, but we obtain a similar pattern when we put everyone together, where it seems that indeed, when we come across the threshold stimulation, we seem to really have two Gaussians that contribute to the distribution. So it's very suggestive of the idea that we have two distributions, some that might correspond to non-conscious trials and some that might correspond to conscious trials. Okay, so in the end, we can then use activations recorded at each trial. We use the trial by trial MVPA activation for each time sample around the presentation of the stimulus. We use these trial by trial activations, and we try to fit either our bifurcation model or our unimodal model to see which of these two explains the data best at this time point. Okay, and these are the results of this Bayesian models comparison at the group level. So we also have a null model, which is assuming that the activations do not relate to the stimulus strength. You see that the null model wins before the presentation of the stimulus. It makes sense, and then its protected exceedance probability is really low. Whereas in the initial period after the presentation of the stimulus, we see that the unimodal nonlinear dynamics is the most probable model explaining the majority of the activations across the group. And then we have a switch for the bifurcation model. And that's around 300 to 700 milliseconds after the presentation of the stimulus. Okay, so the last step we can take now is that maybe we can use activations on each trial and at a specific time point to predict, based on recorded activity, to predict whether at the end of the trial the participant is going to say, yeah, I've heard the stimulus, or no, I haven't heard the stimulus. How do we do that? Well, since we fit our two models, and for example, we fit the bifurcation model actually predicts for a specific SNR, predicts the distribution that we should have for non-conscious trials and the distribution that we should have for conscious trials for the same stimulation at this specific intensity. So that's the prediction of the bifurcation model as fitted to the data of a specific participant at a specific time point. And then we can take activity at each trial. That's the brain activity level for an individual trial, and see whether for this trial it's more probable that this trial was conscious or not. Okay, and then we compare this this prediction from the model to the actual rating of the subject, and this is what we obtain. So predicting audibility response based on neural activity alone, and we see that we can reach very good prediction performance using this bifurcation model, suggesting that indeed our two stages that we assume in the bifurcation model seem to match really well with the responses that the participant give of their own subjective experience. So, okay, so indeed it seems that this split occurring in the bifurcation models matches the conscious versus non-conscious split. Right, but that was in the active session. What happens in for passive listening? So that's activity in the active session. And we have these late activity that correspond to bifurcation dynamics. And the big question is, are these late activations, which are seem to correspond to P300, are these corresponding to task-related processes, or do they correspond to a signature of conscious access? If they are only task-related, well, then they should disappear when people listen passively to the stimulus. If they correspond to conscious access in general, they should remain even when you become spontaneously aware of the stimulus in this experiment. Because indeed, in this experiment, there are some stimuli that are well above threshold and that you should become aware of anyway, even if you're not paying attention to them, even if you're not making a task on these stimuli. So what do we actually observe? Well, that's the initial processing. And for the late activity, well, we don't seem to match either of the two extreme predictions, which is even more interesting. So what we observe is that there are some late activity, they are late and sustained. So late activity is not abolished, but its topography is completely different from a P300. And in this respect, we actually reproduce some other results in other types of no report paradigms that suggest that indeed the P300 is abolished when you don't have to make a task on the stimulus. So how do we interpret these late non-P300 events? Well, one possibility is that these late events do correspond to a spontaneous conscious access to the stimulus, but without articulating that with a task. And so these late activations might be included in the P300. And that's what we do. We can demonstrate using cross-classification that this late passive activity is included in the active P300. Yeah, so I won't explain this this analysis, but it's all described in the paper. We can demonstrate that this late activity is indeed included in the P300, and that's the cross-classification analysis that I'm referring to. So the last thing we can do is try to reconstruct the cortical sources of these late activations. And we see that in the active condition, we have this old network that is activated. In the passive condition, the network seems to be reduced, but we still see activations in temporal, but also frontal and parietal areas. Again, we must take that with a pinch of salt because this is EEG source reconstruction. But what's most interesting is the difference between the two patterns of activations, which is clearly set in motor areas and more generally executive areas. And that makes a lot of sense. So it seems to suggest that what's occurring during the late time window in passive listening is something like the active session, but for the executive system. So if we consider that this might be a global workspace, then this might be a global playground, so a network of areas that is maintaining activations during a late period, maybe circulating sensory information in a network, but for no particular purpose. And the difference being the connection or not to a task-related network. And the last analysis is really to see whether this global playground does show these bifurcation dynamics. And this is indeed what we see in the variability profile for these late activations. And we can then try to fit our models to the data, and especially the bifurcation model can help us predict whether the subject was conscious of the stimulus or not. Well, but the problem is that we don't ask people whether they were conscious of the stimulus or not. Well, we don't, because it's in the passive session, but we do collect interesting introspective activity in the form of mind-wandering probes. So from time to time in these passive sessions, we ask people to report whether what they had in their mind, whether they were asleep or thinking of the task, or thinking of their, well, they were lost in their thought, or they were thinking of the sound. Okay, and based on the predictions of our bifurcation model, we tried to predict whether people would say at the end of the trial, "Oh, I was thinking of the sound. I had the sound in my mind," versus something else. Okay, and indeed, we could predict that people would say that they perceive the sound versus lost in their thoughts, etc., using trial by trial activity just before this mind-wandering probe. So that's not as strong as what we see in the active session, but that's still, I think, remarkable because it's only 10% of the data. Okay, so I'll skip through intracranial recording data of the same protocol, where we see nice bifurcation dynamics in inferior frontal and insula, but not axial gyrus, to maybe, yeah, synthesis saying, well, probably these bifurcation dynamics help us in a protocol where the neural correlates of conscious access include early and late activations. They help us draw a line still at the point where these correlates become mechanisms, actually, because around 200, 300 milliseconds, that's the point where spontaneously we see a jump in brain activity that seems to stick really well with what people report, even on spontaneous listening. Okay? And another remark is that probably these late activity contain both conscious access and task performance when you have to have task performance. So conscious access mechanisms might be supplemented or not by task-related events. Well, at least that's the conclusion we could draw from this study. So can we probe conscious access in non-communicating patients using this? Well, that's what we are trying to do. So we have very, very preliminary data. So that's just 1 minute just to show you this, and I'd like to discuss with you these results or this approach. Here is what we obtain in a vegetative patient in a similar protocol. One first very interesting observation is that to obtain actually activations that increase with the stimulation on a large scale, we need to stimulate to send sounds that are much higher than the sounds we used in healthy controls, like around 35 dBs. For controls, we were here, actually. So that's a first observation that is, I think, really interesting. The other thing that we'd like to see, that's okay, for the moment it's complicated, is, well, can we look at the relationship between mean activity and variability in activity, so standard deviation. In this patient, we clearly see that standard deviation just follows the mean, which is exactly what is expected from unimodal dynamics. So it seems that, for example, in this vegetative patient, we seem to have a clear sign of only unimodal dynamics, which and no evidence for bifurcation, so maybe no evidence of these mechanisms of conscious access. Okay, that's a possibility that's really work in progress. And in contrast, we have an exit MCS patient with this profile for the mean, and the variability profile is really different from what we see in the vegetative patient, where we seem to see a burst of variability around the threshold. But obviously, that's to be continued. We need to optimize the protocol in various senses, because that's a fine dynamical analysis, analyzing noise. And can you imagine analyzing noise in patients where the recordings are already very, very noisy? So we need to optimize the protocol. We'd like to use BCI to adapt the stimulation to the patient's threshold. And obviously, for this exit MCS patient, we might have found exactly the threshold, and obviously test associations between these signatures and other measures that are helpful in patients. So I'd like to thank you for your attention and thank my collaborators on this project and my current team.